All right. Thank you guys so much for taking my little survey just to get you guys into the the mentality of what we're going to talk about today. Let's see. Loki and the psychology of narcissism. I read most or all of y'all's comments, and we'll just see, where people end at the end of the talk, if your thoughts stay the same, if they change. And I'm looking forward to it. So who am I? I am Brittany Ferguson. I am a physician assistant, or PA. We do a lot of the same things doctors do, write prescriptions, order lab tests, give diagnoses. We're advanced practice professionals, sort of like nurse practitioners. There's a shortage of physicians, and so PAs and nurse practitioners, those professions were created so we can be quickly trained and fill the shortage of medical providers. PAs, we are trained in primary care primarily. That's what I do, actually. I'm a primary care provider. So, doing annual checkups, treating diabetes, hypertension, that sort of thing. But for the first 8 years of my career, I practiced med psych, so medicine and psychiatry. And PAs, we don't have board certification outside of primary care, but we do have something called a certificate of added qualifications that we can do to demonstrate our expertise in a subject matter. So I have a CAQ in psychiatry. Just to kind of, this is like my, who am I and why am I the person to give this talk? The other thing about it is that this is actually my 6th talk for the science track. I typically pick some sort of TV or movie, often superheroes, super villains, and then some media where they're trying to portray some sort of mental health concept, and then I explore that. And so today is more of that. My self-assigned objectives are, I'm going to highlight narcissism on the Disney Plus, actually like in all of the MCU iterations of Loki, but I'm going to highlight narcissism. We're going to compare narcissistic personality disorder to antisocial personality disorder, more on that later. We're going to learn the causes of narcissism and review treatment options, and hopefully save at least 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. I do this picture every year. Spoiler alert, Darth Vader is Luke's father. Tony Stark dies, Thanos snaps half the universe away. I talk about anything and everything I want, so if you haven't seen anything that Loki's in, I don't know, there's spoilers. So who is Loki? Loki begins before the comic book villain. It starts in Norse mythology, so Scandinavian mythology. And he is the god of mischief, the son of Odin, the brother of Thor. And this is a picture of that iteration of Loki. He then was in Marvel Comics, so he made his debut in the Thor comic Journey into Mystery, number 85, and has had his own spin-off comic series. In terms of Thor movies, he's been in 3 out of the 4 movies. He's also been in 3 out of the 4 Avengers films. And just like every other villain and side character, he now has his own Disney Plus TV show, which is complete. It is 2 seasons. Getting into season 1, just to kind of recap, the Avengers are going back in time and they're trying to find Infinity Stones. And when they're trying to get this version of the Tesseract, they flub it, and this version or this variant of Loki gets the Tesseract, transports, but is immediately arrested by the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, for crimes against the sacred timeline. He then meets Mobius, who's like, hey, we're actually hunting this very dangerous variant of you. Will you help us? They do that, and she's a lady. Her name is Sylvie. And Loki kind of has a thing for her. When Mobius finds this out, he responds, "You incredible seismic narcissist. You fell for yourself." And so right then when I saw that line, I actually wanted to do this a year ago. I'm kind of glad I waited though. And, I just thought that was so interesting, right? So basically Mobius is proclaiming that because Loki met another version of himself, is in love with her, that's narcissism. And, I guess like maybe he has this idea because of the story of Narcissus. That's where we get the term narcissism from. Narcissus, not Norse mythology, but rather Greek mythology. He was a hunter from Thespia, and he was very pretty. Everybody was in love with him. Any gender, gods, mortals, everybody loved Narcissus, but Narcissus could not be bothered, and no one could get his affections. Until one day this story is told in a bunch of different ways, but in however it happened, he happens upon this pond, sees a reflection of himself, and falls deeply in love with his own reflection. He, upon the realization that this is going to be an unrequited love, that his reflection will never be able to love him back, he dies. And in the spot that he died, the narcissus flower grew. So basically, when Mobius is like, oh, you fell in love with yourself, it's sort of like instead of Narcissus looking in the pond, Loki is looking in the mirror and likes what he sees and falls in love. And that's what narcissism is, right? What is a narcissist? So it's a household term at this point. When the word gets used, most of the time there's this colloquial version of it that is being used. It garners 1 million monthly searches online. Is my boss a narcissist? Is my partner not narcissist? Am I a narcissist? But roughly when people use it in colloquial speech, they mean that it is an excessive interest or admiration in oneself. But there's actually a range of narcissism. And on one end of the spectrum is healthy narcissism. So while in colloquial speech, we use it as a pejorative, there can actually be healthy levels of narcissism. So what is healthy narcissism? Well, it's a healthy self-love. It's sort of related to self-esteem and self-worth, but those terms are not synonymous. And another way of saying it is its ability to take joy in oneself and one's accomplishments. So for example, if I'm going to work every day and I take the moment to be like, I did a good job, I get a little bit of a hit of dopamine, and that's a good thing because healthy narcissism can contribute to resilience. If I don't take that moment to kind of pat myself on the back and like what I'm doing and what I'm bringing to the table, what would happen when things get really tough? And am I still going to make the move forward to push through and do the harder thing? Well, if I'm constantly giving myself that reinforcement of a hit of dopamine, maybe I am. So again, on one end of the spectrum is healthy narcissism. And in the MCU, maybe a good example of that is Dr. Darcy Lewis. She is an astrophysicist, well, first an intern in the Thor series, and then later in WandaVision, she's gotten her doctorate. And, she just takes the moments to celebrate herself. She knows she's the smartest cookie in the room, and, she doesn't bash away from that. But on the other end of the spectrum is pathological narcissism. So the word pathological meaning that it's causing a problem. And what I'm going to seek to explore with you guys is Loki on that end of the spectrum. To do that, we're going to look at the DSM criteria. So the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is not a perfect system by any means, but it is the tool that I use as a medical professional, and it is commonly used. So why do we have this? It gives us a nosology. Nosos in Greek means disease, ology means the study of, but specifically nosology is a classification of disease. So it's the way that we classify diseases. And what this does is it gives us a shared language that we can use to give diagnoses, do research, which can inform treatment. And also for some people, having a word to explain the phenomenon that they're experiencing can be personally meaningful. So when you have a word to call it, you can say, yes, that is what I'm experiencing. In the DSM, there is 10 personality disorders that are described, but we're going to focus on narcissistic personality disorder. Before we can define what a personality disorder is, we have to say, what is a personality? So a personality is an individual worldview that shapes our emotions, our behaviors, how we interact in day-to-day living, that is consistent over time and generally who we think of as ourselves. Compared to a personality disorder, which is all of those things, but it deviates from cultural expectations. So a person has a personality, but the constellation of those emotions and behaviors are different than what a society would expect. It also has to cause either psychological distress or impairment in functioning, social, work, etc. Just like a personality, it is consistent and pervasive over time, but I'm doubling down on that just to say that, like, you know, if I in my 20s was a particular way, I can't use the word brat anymore because it means something different, but the 90s version of brat, then, you know, that's different, right? It has to be over a lifetime for you to consider something a personality disorder. And it can't be better explained by a substance or a medical condition. So if I'm struggling with alcohol use disorder and I'm more irritable and prone to outbursts and confrontation while struggling with alcohol use disorder, but not when I'm not using alcohol, that isn't a personality disorder. That's the effects of a substance. Or conversely, with a medical condition, for an example, if I had a traumatic brain injury and my personality changed, there is a diagnosis for that, but it isn't a personality disorder. It is personality disorder due to an organic brain issue. Personality disorders are very common. So 9% of Americans can be diagnosed with any personality disorder. And up to 6.2% of Americans can be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. All right, so everyone has these pieces, well, maybe not everyone has the piece of paper, but 100 people have the piece of paper. Oh, there, we have 5 left if you need one. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And we're gonna go through them one by one, and you can check off if you think that Loki meets the criteria. I'm gonna tell you what I think, but you don't have to agree, okay? And so just to overview that first, again, we're gonna go into these specific criteria more in depth, but just to overview it, any personality disorder is a pattern of thoughts and behavior beginning in early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. But narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by 5 of the following 9 symptoms: grandiosity, arrogance, dreams of success and power, a need to be special, requiring attention, a sense of entitlement, being interpersonally exploitative, being envious, and lacking empathy. So let's get into it. Criteria 1, grandiosity. This is a sense of superiority, uniqueness, or invulnerability that is unrealistic. By a show of hands, who thinks that Loki is grandiose? Okay, put your hands down. Who doesn't? Okay, yeah. So Loki's like a literal god witch whose magical powers include shape-shifting, duplication casting, and teleportation. So it depends on how you define grandiosity, and I'll just be honest, the way that I'm defining it is a little bit more specific than the DSM gives us guidance. But if it's an unrealistic sense of superiority or uniqueness, I'm gonna say no, just because he does literally have powers. But let's compare that to arrogance. So arrogance is an exaggerated sense of one's own importance and abilities. Who here thinks Loki is arrogant? Okay, put your hands down. Who doesn't? All right, okay, all right. So just an example in Avengers 1, Hulk smashes down and Loki just stops him and is like, all of you are beneath me. He then gets pulverized by Hulk, but you know, in his heart of hearts, he does believe it when he says it. So if arrogance is an exaggerated sense of one's own importance ability, he has abilities, but it's a little exaggerated in the face of Hulk. So I'm going to give it to him. Criteria 3 is dreaming of success and power. So this is constantly fantasizing about success, power. It could also be like being especially beautiful or desirable or ideal love. By show of hands, who thinks that Loki, his personality is characterized by dreaming of success and power? All right, put your hands down. Who doesn't? All right, I like the brave people. Yes. Thank you for participating. Because yeah, I mean, we could debate this, but for me, I think, you know, his basic catchphrase is, "I am Loki of Asgard, and I am burdened with glorious purpose." I think this is pretty hallmark to Loki and who he is. He dreams of this glorious purpose. So I'm going to give him the criteria. A need to be special or unique. So this can sometimes be only feeling like they should associate with other unique, important, or powerful people or entities, or maybe only be understood by other high status people. Raise your hand if you think he meets this criteria. Okay. And if you don't. Okay. So just one example from Loki season 1, Hunter B15, she's saying that they're about to go hunt down this Loki variant, but what type of Loki remains unknown, to which Loki, our Loki, quickly replies, the lesser kind. So among all Lokis in the infinite multiverse, he's definitely the most important. So I gave him this criteria. Requiring attention or admiration. A preoccupation with others' regard may be expected to be greeted with fanfare. Raise your hands if you think he meets this criteria. All right, and not. All right. So in Thor Ragnarok, Loki's supposed to be dead, and Thor comes back to Asgard, and there's this huge statue erected in his honor, and there's this play on repeat, just like honoring the sacrifice that Loki made, but really it is Loki that has erected this statue and is putting on this show, and he's posing as Odin. So yeah, I think he's kind of a peacock. So a sense of entitlement. That is unreasonable expectations of favorable treatment or automatic compliance. Who doesn't think that he meets it? Okay, yeah. And who does? Okay. So just one example that I came up with in Avengers 1, Loki comes down. He's never been to New York, I think, or maybe he's been to New York, but it's been a minute, hundreds of years, who knows? Swoops down, does a little bit of magic, and tells everyone to kneel before him. He also talks a lot about his birthright of being the king of Midgard, and like why, who knows, but I think that demonstrates a sense of entitlement and an expectation that he would be a ruler of the lesser human beings. Being interpersonally exploitative, so taking advantage of others to their own ends. Who doesn't think that he meets this criteria? Anyone? Anyone? Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I agree. So, I mean, in his own words, by nature, my people are gullible fools, a trait that I, the god of mischief, have exploited time and time again. I betrayed everyone who ever loved me, my father, my brother, my home. So I gave him the criteria. Envy, being envious. Is often envious of others or believes people are envious of them. By a show of hands, who thinks he does meet this criteria? Interesting. And who doesn't? Yeah, I hope. Oh man, I'm gonna ask. So interesting. Someone say why. that thinks he is envious. Yeah, yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay. So yeah, so in the MCU for sure, his character is defined by an envy of his brother, right? I agree 100%. But that was the only example I could come up with. And for something to be a personality disorder, it really can't just be in one area of life. Like it can't just be like, oh, he's envious of his brother. In narcissistic personality disorder, if a person had this characteristic, it would be more pervasive. So thinking more people are envious of them or being envious of other people. It would have to be in like a variety of contexts and pretty, yeah, you seem like you really want to say something. Oh, okay, so let's see. I definitely can repeat the second one. The second one was that he's envious of other versions of Loki, and then the first one was that he's envious of other Asgardians. Okay, yeah, because he's actually an ice giant being envious of other Asgardians. So fair, right? And I think I'm gonna actually move forward, but I think that is interesting. I still didn't give him the criteria, but I think that your points are valid. Last criteria, 9 out of 9, lacking empathy. Being unwilling to take another's perspective or being unable to value another's perspective. Who thinks he does meet this criteria? Okay, and who doesn't? All right, yeah. So I was kind of maybe confused a little bit about this criteria because you'll notice that part of the definition isn't a lack of ability to empathize or take another's perspective. And Loki is incredibly emotionally intelligent. I think he is able to take other people's perspectives. His own mother says the same thing in Loki 2, or in Thor 2. She says, "You're always so perceptive about everyone but yourself." But this criteria isn't actually a lack of an ability to empathize or take another's perspective. In fact, you could definitely have that. It's the lack of valuing another's perspective as being equal to your own, or being able to like hold it and value it. So maybe, right, in any of the MCU iterations of Loki that we've seen, but for sure in Loki season 2, we do see him start to take other people's perspective and hold it. So I'm not sure if he meets this criteria. So again, you guys can make your marks about what you guys think. And these are the 9 that we just went over. But before we can really say whether or not we think Loki meets criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, we have 2 more questions to answer. Because on the scale of narcissism, from healthy narcissism to pathological narcissism, you cannot diagnose a personality disorder unless if you answer, does it cause distress or impairment? So, exactly. So, what is distress? So, distress is typically referring distress to the self. There needs to be a certain level of self-recognition to have this. And it is something that in any sort of mental health diagnosis tends to bring the person to treatment when they're bringing themselves to treatment because they themselves are distressed by what is happening. Compare that to impairment, which typically, well, it can impair the person and they know that they are impaired, but it's typically because it's distressing to others. So for example, a person living with narcissistic personality disorder thinks like, yes, everything's going well at work and my boss is very unhappy with my work performance. But that doesn't have anything to do with me, that has to do with them. Whereas for the boss's perspective, it would be not that, right? It would be, no, it is your behavior. So for impairment, the person might not recognize that their symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder are problematic, right? They might say they're not. And so impairment might have others bring the person living with narcissistic personality disorder to treatment. So like, for example, divorce or marriage counseling. And then if the person is unwilling to go to treatment, then it just might lead others in their lives to treatment. And all of that would count for diagnostic criteria. So if the person's characteristics are leading others to treatment and leading others to be distressed, causing impairment in their life, then they can meet criteria. And in narcissistic personality disorder, it is more common for people to meet criteria through impairment rather than distress, but either can. So what do you guys think? Do the symptoms that you agreed Loki had for narcissistic personality disorder, do they cause him impairment? Raise your hand if you think they do. Okay, and raise your hand if you don't. Okay. So, you know, we know that Loki was at least arrested once directly from his characteristics that are characteristic of MPD, like in Avengers 1. So thinking I need to be the leader of Midgard, taking the attack on New York, and then being thrown into Asgardian prison. And then we also see him later get arrested by the Time Variance Authority. So I said yes. What about distress? Is Loki distressed by his symptoms of narcissistic personality disorder? Raise your hand if you think yes. Okay, raise your hand if you think no. All right. So in Loki season 1, episode 1, it's like after he escapes from Mobius and is trying to like get out of the TVA, he feels defeated, sits down and says to Mobius, you know, I don't enjoy hurting people. I do it because I have to. It's the cruel, elaborate trick conjured by the weak to inspire fear, a villain. I think that this represents psychological distress. He knows that the things that he's doing are not, I mean, whether they're right or wrong, he doesn't like them, right? He's saying like, oh, I'm a villain, right? People who are villains don't call themselves villains. So I gave him this criteria. All right, so again, tally up your marks. I'm gonna do a Q&A at the end. And by a show of hands, who has listed 5 or more of the 9 symptoms and either impairment or distress? Okay, put your hands down. And who didn't mark off what was needed to diagnose MPD? Okay, perfect. So just to recap my tallies, I gave him arrogance, dreams of success and power, a need to be special, requiring attention, sense of entitlement, being interpersonally exploitative, impairment, and distress. So based off of the way that I'm interpreting the show, I did diagnose him with MPD, or I think he could meet criteria. Just a temporary aside, who has heard the term like psychopath before? Okay, or sociopath? Okay, so I think that these terms are used more commonly in colloquial speech. They are actually researched by psychologists, but in the DSM, neither of those terms exist. The thing that we have closest to that is antisocial personality disorder, and that is more similar to sociopathy. So we'll explore that just for a second, because I think that this might be something that gets a little bit confused with NPD. So antisocial personality disorder is a pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. Unlike other personality disorders, it actually has to be, you have to see these traits beginning at age 15. Other personality disorders, it's 18. So they have to have 3 or more of the following: a lack of remorse, deceitfulness, failure to conform to norms or laws, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, irritability and aggressiveness, or inconsistent irresponsibility, or consistent irresponsibility. So we already went through the criteria of NPD, but just to compare that a little bit more to antisocial personality disorder, Antisocial personality disorder has a lack of remorse, which is not the same, but kind of similar to lack of empathy. There's deceitfulness, not exactly the same, but pretty similar to being interpersonally exploitative. And then that's about where the similarities end. So failure to conform to norms, impulsivity, irritability or aggressiveness, irresponsibility, those are unique to antisocial personality disorder. And you can be diagnosed with more than one personality disorder. And the personality disorders that tend that exist, there are symptom overlap, all right? So they have some things in common, some things similar. People can experience both. But just curious, this is just like kind of quick and dirty. By show of hands, who thinks that Loki does meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder? Okay, all right, I was like, not a single person. Okay. Yeah, so me going through it really quickly, does he have a lack of remorse? I don't know. I also didn't give him the criteria for lack of empathy. Is he deceitful? Yeah, I think so. Failure to conform to social norms or laws, like breaking the law, having repeated grounds for arrest. Yeah, for sure. Is he impulsive and fails to plan ahead? Well, Loki always talks about having a plan. I mean, it's not necessarily a good plan, but the criteria doesn't say it has to be a good plan. So, is he irritable and aggressive? I don't know. And is he irresponsible? I don't know. I couldn't think of any examples of that. So, but really the point isn't to like diagnose these fictitious characters, but rather just to explore the concept. So it doesn't matter. No, throw your pieces of paper in the air. Don't. There's a prize at the end. So we're going to go back to narcissistic personality disorder and talk about the pathophysiology. So nosos means disease, so does pathos. Logia still means the study of, but pathophysiology is like why diseases or issues form. And so genetics is implicated for narcissistic personality disorder. Like some studies have shown maybe there is a genetic heritability of it. Also, certain brain regions have been implicated in lack of empathy, the anterior insula and the median cingulate cortex. So nature versus nurture, the psychosocial theories around narcissistic personality disorder include parental style and a child's development in their sense of self. But when we talk about personality disorders, for the most part, there's this question of do they form because at some point in that individual's life were they adaptive? Was it helpful for the person to have those personality traits? Did it, help them with their survival tension? What purpose did it serve? Because at some point it probably did serve some purpose. And one way that we think about that in mental health for narcissistic personality disorder specifically is unmet childhood needs. And so with Loki, his father Odin, since he was a young child, kind of pitted him and Thor against each other, right? We see that in Thor 1. He says, one of you will be king. You have to have these certain traits to be able to ascend the throne. But the joke is on Loki because, as someone in the audience mentioned earlier, he's not actually the biological son of Odin. He is the son of Odin's enemy. And so Loki was never going to be chosen to be king. And on some level, he knows that. And you can imagine how this had an effect on Loki's sense of self-worth. I mean, his father literally creates a hammer that only the worthy can pick up, and his brother can, and he cannot. So one way we think about narcissistic personality disorder and why it's formed is that it is an issue in regulation of self-esteem, right? So a person's sense of worth might be low, you could exhibit that and be like, yeah, I have low self-esteem, et cetera. But sometimes actually the opposite happens, right? And so it's not that I'm unworthy, but rather I am the most worthy and I am the best, right? It's not that I'm this bad thing, actually you're just envious of me. In terms of treatment, there is no gold standard of treatment for NPD. Unfortunately, it's not very well researched. personality disorders in general don't get a lot of attention. Luckily, borderline personality disorder does get a lot of research now, but it didn't always. So I can't say this is like the gold standard of treatment. Definitely not the gold standard of treatment. It's not medications. There's no medication to treat narcissistic personality disorder. Medications do get used, but they're to treat co-occurring problems. So for example, if a person living with narcissism is depressed, perhaps a SSRI or an SNRI would be prescribed to treat their depression. But what we do have is therapy, and there are a couple of different therapy modalities that can be used. Just to kind of highlight those, psychodynamic therapy, that's when you think of like Freud and a person and the couch. People like, I was probably trained that psychodynamic therapy was the gold standard for NPD. It isn't, but they definitely think of it as being in their wheelhouse. And the way that therapy works is it's the therapist-patient relationship sort of serving as a mirror to build insight into the person's self and then inform like how they might change their behaviors. Cognitive behavioral therapy is interested in a person's thoughts and behaviors. It looks at schemas, like a way a person envisions the world, and core beliefs, like beliefs that a person might hold central that inform their behaviors, and tries to change that in ways that help the person live the life they want to live. And then DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, has 4 major tenets: mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so you could see how all 4 of those skills could be helpful for someone living with NPD. But for any sort of therapy to work, there first has to be a willingness to change. And so for Loki in the first season, I think we see that in the first episode when he comes across this drawer filled with infinity stones. So he's running around convinced he's going to be able to escape from the TVA. But once he sees this drawer, he just sits down and is like, is this the most powerful entity in the universe? And we see a shift in who he is and how he's interacting with the rest of the characters. And the initial target of therapy is going to be to increase an individual's self-awareness, so starting with the person living with NPD. And in the show, I think we see that through Loki exploring how other Lokis are. And the question gets asked, what makes a Loki? So he's meeting all these other Lokis and asking, is this what makes a Loki? All these Lokis have these things in common. Are they true for me? Do I want them to be true for me? Could I be different, or is this inherent to who I am and who we are? Once a person has an increased self-awareness, then the target would be to help them recognize others' emotions as valuable. And with Loki, we see him initially do this with Sylvie. So he sees ways that they're similar, but also how she is a completely distinct and separate person. And he shows a lot of empathy for her story and her narrative and how she is so different. And then from there, just to increase a person's capacity for empathy, which by the second season, it's not just Sylvie that he cares about, but OB and Mobius and Hunter B15 and Casey. Another thing that I think we see in the show, in terms of like from a cognitive behavioral perspective, he starts off with this core belief, I'm a villain, season 1, episode 1. But then in the last episode of the second and final season, we see this new core belief form. He says, I know I'm the type of God I need to be. And the implication is a heroic one. So what have we learned? Just to recap, I basically did this talk because of Mobius saying that Loki was an incredible seismic narcissist because he fell for himself, right? That he saw a reflection of himself in Sylvie. And so basically narcissism, the implication is that narcissism is self-love. And that's what we learned today, right? Narcissism is just loving yourself. Does everyone agree? No, right? No, thank you. Okay. No, so that's not what narcissism is. Narcissism is self-worth dysregulation, right? The things that I hope you take away from this talk is that personality shapes our respective worldviews, that narcissism exists on a spectrum, and that narcissistic personality disorder is treatable. All the talks that I do, really, they're because I want people to continue to educate themselves. One good resource is this book, The New Science of Narcissism. It is both very approachable and very thorough. And the 10th chapter actually specifically talks about Dragon Con. I'm not joking. I'm not joking. You have to read it, I guess, yeah, a little bit. And I hope that you share what you know with other people. Not only that, I hope you stay curious. Like I mentioned before, the research on NPD is actually fairly limited in the realm of mental health. So what I said today, we'll have a better understanding for sure in 6 months, a year, 10 years. It's going to keep changing. And all of this just because I think that we have made a lot of progress in battling stigma against mental health, but there's a lot of work to still be done. Stigma is the #1 reason why people don't seek out treatment. And people can live the lives that they want. So, so I hope that you'll join me in trying to battle stigma. I have a special thanks to Dan Upshaw, Amanda Plum, and Ed Whalen. They're all variants of Loki who helped me listen to my talk and get prepared for today. These are some references. These are more references. You don't have to take pictures because I will upload this talk at this QR code and you can look at them or you can contact me on Instagram. And with that, I will open it up for our Q&A.
I just had a question about, I know like DSM doesn't talk about malignant narcissism, but could you maybe talk more about that subcategory? And I guess it's seen as like, right, it's a more malignant version, but I would love more info on that.
Yeah, so when I was developing this talk, I did think about talking about, it's actually like there are 3 researchers look at 3 versions of narcissism. And the one that I mostly talked about was vulnerable narcissism. And then there is like high functioning narcissism. And then I do believe the 3rd one is malignant narcissism. And so I think basically where they are on this is that sure, in some people, narcissism is masking deep-seated vulnerability, but in some people it's not. And maybe that sort of like the difference with like sociopathy and psychopathy or whatever, maybe that has more to do with like a biological heritability aspect, but just that those same traits are there, but that it isn't masking vulnerability, it's just present.
Hi.
Hey.
So I'm wondering how, if at all, have the diagnostic qualities of personality disorders changed from earlier versions of the DSM? And then with the sort of 6% of the percentages, how does that compare to, say, like a mood disorder or some other Axis 1 type diagnosis in terms of how common they are?
Oh, sure. So, I actually didn't go back. I have like almost all the versions. I think I have all the versions of the DSM, and I do like tracking how they change. I'm not sure how narcissism has changed. I know where it's going though, and it's going very different, which is probably in our next DSM, we won't have those criteria, which to be fair, all my students ever, when I've like taught this in PA classes and stuff, hate this diagnostic criteria because it's just some of them, they just seem so overlapping and not everybody exhibits all those things. So it's going to be more of a spectrum and 4 major kind of branches. And then for your question about, I already lost oh, the percentage. So 6.2% for a personality disorder might seem high, but for like major depression, which is a very common mental health diagnosis or anxiety, those percentages are closer to 20 and 30%. So, less common than like major depression or a generalized anxiety disorder. Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering, as far as some of the criteria you use that reference like the Avenger movie, how much of that do you have to wonder if it wasn't because, for a large portion of that, he was A, playing the crowd, and B, under surveillance from, the other.
Yeah. I think that that's fair, right? And like at the end of the day, it wouldn't be right for me to diagnose someone that I don't know and isn't my patient. And most providers aren't going to diagnose someone with a personality disorder formally on their chart until they've known them for at least over a year, if not more, depending on how often they're meeting. And then what is the utility of giving that diagnosis, right? So me personally, I've never really put a personality disorder on someone's chart unless if I thought it was essential to communicate that information to other providers who might be interacting with that patient. And the reason for that is because there's just so much stigma associated with it. So to recap my answer to your question, right? I can't just actually take these small glimpses in a person's life and make this diagnosis, right? So, I would need to know more. Was that just a performative sort of thing in this one instance, or is it more characteristic of Loki's whole life and the way he interacts in multiple contexts?
Are you familiar with quiet or covert narcissism? And have you ever seen a character in media that represents such a thing?
Covert narcissism. I think I have, but can you tell me briefly what it is?
Yes, like basically compared to like Loki, where narcissists we typically see they're very out loud, everything's about me, etc. A covert person is more
yeah.
kind of undercurrent, like, oh hey, I'm your friend, so on and so forth. Oh, I want to stay in the background, but they really still want to make things about themselves.
So sometimes actually vulnerable narcissism gets called covert narcissism because there's less of the grandiosity and the me, look at me sort of aspect of it. But I think also when we talk about these three types of narcissism, that there's a lot of overlap. And so I think that's something that researchers look at and they think about because that's how we do research, right? We kind of have to put things into boxes. And then practically as a clinician, it just is never that cookie cutter black and white.
Hello,
Hey.
hi. So I just had a quick question over the discussion of the criteria. While we were going over that, you were able to pull from like different snapshots of Loki's life and timeline. But if you're ever looking at someone and diagnosing, it's only from that one moment. And so like, if you were to like talk to Loki at like the end of the Loki series, a lot of these criteria would probably be no. Versus if you talk to him at the beginning of like Avengers 1, a lot of the criteria, almost all the criteria would probably be yes.
Right.
And so my question kind of is then like, when in this kind of discussion, how does the cherry picking kind of affect our perception there? Or should we like only focus on the latest iteration or a specific iteration?
Yeah, I mean, and this is true for any diagnosis. So when, as a clinician, I'm meeting with someone, the system kind of wants me to give a diagnosis, right? So I can bill for my services and justify the treatment that I'm going to recommend and blah, blah, blah. But we're working off of this limited information. And often if you have the privilege of working with someone long enough, you might end up changing your perspective because you're getting to know that person. I mean, like I never will know my patients the way they know themselves. So I'm also kind of depending on their narrative and what they're telling me to make my best recommendation to guide treatment. So, if Loki was my patient in Avengers 1, would I probably think that he has narcissistic traits at the minimum? Yes, right? And then at the end of season 2, would I think that? I don't know, maybe not, right? I mean, if I got that history and if it keeps coming up, but in ways that show that he has control over those symptoms, I'm not sure. But diagnosing is an imperfect system. And as a clinician, I'm only ever really thinking about what is helpful to the individual in front of me, what is going to help them get towards living their best life.
Hi, I was just kind of wondering, I actually studied with Dr. Campbell, the guy who wrote that book, which
Nice.
is really cool. But like a big issue with narcissism is that oftentimes they don't recognize that as being an issue. And I was kind of wondering, because like Loki's almost forced to acknowledge his issues and how he needs to change in order to change. And I was wondering if you've ever experienced that in IRL, if you think that's like a realistic example of how people can kind of come to deal with some of their symptoms.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, 100%. I think that my first jobs or whatever, when people that I worked with had narcissistic traits, we were always working on something else because people were coming to me for something else, depression, anxiety, etc. And then maybe some talking about narcissism would kind of come up, but if there wasn't that sort of insight and there was other things we were prioritizing, those other things would get prioritized. Now, as a primary care provider, I mean, 6.2% of Americans, that's a lot of people. So I see it every day, but it isn't affecting maybe not anyone right now that I work with. It's not affecting our treatment. It isn't something they want to work on. And so it's not something that gets worked on. It's just something, kind of in the back of my mind. I think, oh, this person, has some narcissistic traits.
The great thing about the character of Loki, I feel like, is in psychology, and that's the premise, obviously, for this panel. Would you say that the Loki show, like, do you think it is a natural progression at all from the very fully realized, like, psychological, narcissistic character of Loki in Avengers 1 to suddenly go to someone who kind of is completely different, seemingly, in the Loki show, or would you say it fits progressive-wise for him?
I have a really good ability to suspend my disbelief. Dan, who had to listen, say hi, Dan, who had to listen to my talk. He's my colleague. We both have worked at Grady for some time. And so for him, he said, no, like this is just completely unrealistic. This isn't how someone would change. But for me, I guess I bought it, I think that Loki has always kind of wanted to be a bit of a sympathetic character, and we did get glimpses of that in the other movies. And yeah, I think when someone has the willingness to change, which he was put in a circumstance that kind of forced his hand. So for me, I really loved the story, and it didn't seem too outlandish to me.
Hi, so I'm actually a current psychology student, and one thing I've heard from professors who work in the field is when it comes to narcissists, they can really only treat behaviors and mitigate impairment because they say there's nothing under the shell, is a term I've heard over and over again. In your experience, how true is that? It's obviously not true of Loki, but he benefits from a highly paid group of writers creating something.
Yeah, so I'm a clinician, and all of my story, like I'm going to take this roundabout way of answering this. I think a person could ask me like, why didn't I make a story about how to live with the narcissist in your life? Since a lot of people with narcissism aren't going to have a lot of insight or want a willingness to change. But as a clinician, I'm always thinking about the person with the diagnosis or the disorder, and so I took that viewpoint in this. And I have ever been a specialist in a diagnosis that clinicians will also say untreatable, give up now. My specialty was in primary psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And it took me, 6 or 7 years of delving deep until I even was offered to be trained in a therapy that I did find very effective for my patients. And when I would go and tell other mental health professionals that I was this expert in schizophrenia and how well all of my patients were doing, people like other professionals just wouldn't believe me, So I'm not an expert in narcissistic personality disorder, but I did make this talk and I do have this viewpoint that just because we are where we are with NPD, as clinicians, thinking about how treatable or not treatable it is. I think we have to push forward, because also, like, people used to think that of borderline personality disorder, and then a person with borderline personality disorder, Marsha Linehan, was like, I'm gonna show y'all, I'm gonna make this therapy, it's gonna help people. And now we can treat borderline personality disorder, so that's my optimistic who I am.
I was just gonna say, so about the envy, I know that you pointed out that he's really only envious of Thor, but he's like envious of him to a level that I would call pathological, like it's such a driving factor in Loki's story. Even though he's not like generally envious. How would that like apply to, I guess, making that like a check mark kind of thing?
I guess for me, I think that that's fair, and it isn't to say, what I'm not saying is, I'm not saying that, Loki's envy of his brother doesn't harm him. I think it does. But so what I am saying is that for this particular criteria, for any of the criteria for personality disorder, the criteria has to be more pervasive, right? Like, can't just be envy of one person. It has to be kind of hallmarked to that person's personality. So being envious of people at work and your direct family members and your social group, thinking other people are envious of you. And the way that that would come across is like the patient is telling me, or the person is telling me, yeah, like people, these things happen because people are envious of me, they're jealous of me. So that's why I said, I didn't think he met the criteria, but I do think that his relationship with his brother and his envy of his brother harms him. I just don't think it's, I don't think that that's a symptom of, it wouldn't meet the criteria, that one criteria.
So one of the things I was thinking about on a similar vein is just how often does something have to occur in order for it to be a check mark? So for example, one of the criteria is the requires attention. However, when he's Odin and there's a thing on stage for Loki, it's like he's being praising himself, but he's not really like being the one being praised.
Mhm.
He's Odin. And then when he spends centuries having Victor be the hero who's gonna be going out with the device. To me, there's a sense of like, I'm not the hero, I'm not the one who's going out to do all the things, I'm not the center of attention, I'm not driving that. At the same time, there's also that sense where he wants the attention, so how do you balance those dichotomies of like, it's not always, but often?
Yeah, I mean, to seriously consider giving the diagnosis, it would have to be multiple instances and multiple areas of life over a very long period of time, and you would have to have the idea that it started around age 18, and then whatever that person's age is that it's been going on, that there are multiple examples of it. I do think that in the MCU, we see a couple of other examples of needing attention. Like, one I thought about putting in was Tony Stark says in Avengers 1, they're trying to think, how are they going to beat Loki? And they say, this guy doesn't just want to like dominate Earth. He wants like his name in letters, that's like who Loki is. So, yeah, I think that we're meant to be given the impression that he likes the attention and he likes being showboaty, but fair, right? And maybe two different clinicians would disagree, if like me and Dan, but I think we agreed on this one. Yeah.
We got time for one more.
Thank you very much. I'm another primary care provider, and I can think of one patient in my panel that probably fits with NPD, but I never really formally diagnosed him. In fact, he's very resistant treatment. I treat his other axis 1 disorders, but he would never go seek therapy or anything like that. Does that kind of fit with your experience as well with some of these patients?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think theoretically 100%. I used to be a consult liaison psychiatry PA, and actually that's more common where I saw it was patients admitted to the hospital and we were being consulted by the primary team because of behaviors that were going on. And I think that what you're doing is correct, right? Like, I don't think that these diagnoses should be given around lightly. For me, I would just use that framework to give that patient some empathy. And if there's any space to work on it, through little touches, like, that could be meaningful, but, but ultimately, I think as a primary care provider, we can kind of throw those little thoughts out, connect them to psychiatrists, and people can engage or not. And then we just stick by them despite how difficult at times it might be working with them. Okay. So, just one last thing, if that's okay. So, it's just, on your way out, if you filled this out, just see, that variant of Loki right there. He has a prize for you. And thank you very much for coming.